started working on getting information together on Croce McIntosh probably last year, maybe before that. And I've been intrigued by what I found, and I wanted to share that at some point. And I was going to offer to do it in September because we didn't have a speaker lined up for then, but we'll try it tonight. Um, just to give you a little background, most of you know Chief William McIntosh Jr. was the signer of the Treaty of Indian Springs. He and several other Creek Indian leaders signed that treaty February 12th, 1825. And last year they celebrated the 200th anniversary of that. About 10 weeks later, on April 25th, 1825, there were about 200 members of the Upper Creeks who were led by Minowa, and they came to what's now Whitesburg and what is now the McIntosh Reserve in Whitesburg. That's where Chief McIntosh lived with his family. And they murdered him there at his home that night. His youngest child was Croce. She was about 2 years old because she was born in 1823. And all this information is noted on the bottom from the late Billie Jane McIntosh's book, Chief William McIntosh, Muskogee Creek Warrior. And that book, I believe, is in the cabinet here, and we may have them available for sale. I don't know. And I say late Billie Jane McIntosh because when some of us went to a workshop in Carrollton a few months ago, that's the first time I had heard that Billie Jane passed away. I tried to call her at the nursing home she was at one time, and that didn't go over real big. Like I said, I've been doing some research on this for a while. So Chief McIntosh's youngest child was Croce, and she was the daughter of his third wife, Peggy, who was a Cherokee. My daughter was helping me with some of the research on this last week while we were all on vacation in Gulf Shores. And she said, well, she thought maybe his first two wives had died, and she didn't realize that Creek Indians could have more than one wife at one time. She didn't like that. So, yeah. Yeah. Most of you have probably heard of Croce's half-brother, who was Chili McIntosh. He was much older than her. He was born in 1801. His mother was the chief's first wife, Eliza Grierson. She was half Scott and half Creek. Now, from here on out, I'm depending on information in this book. I think are there more than these two copies? We've got at least two copies of this book. Coweta County Chronicles, published in 1928. And I'm going to read just a little bit. This is my father's book. And I think he would appreciate this presentation tonight because in his book, he made notes on the inside cover. And right here it says Croce McIntosh, page 38. And that's the biggest writing pretty much that he had on there. So he was intrigued also by Croce and the fact that she came to Senoia. Daddy didn't grow up in Senoia. He grew up in Roscoe in northern Coweta County. But Croce wrote an article for this book. We don't know what age she was when she wrote it. She wasn't a child, and I'll get into the timeline a little later. But it says, how fondly we recall impressions and experiences of joy and sorrow of our early childhood days. The hours spent in the cabin of Croce McIntosh have never been effaced. I had to look that up. Worn out or eliminated. A combined impression of joy as the recipient of the love she had for little children and the awe inspired by her stately ways. So I bring this tribute of fond memory to Croce, of illustrious Indian descent, our adopted daughter. one thing to realize from what I'm understanding from her words is that this ties back to oral history, because Croce was undoubtedly a child sitting in Alice Bagley Fall, who wrote this, was a child sitting in the cabin with Croce. And she was learning how Croce got there and how things developed up to that point. So at some point later in life, Alice Bagley Fall, who wrote this article for this book, recorded her thoughts so that we would know something about Croce. As she pointed out in the chapter in the book, Croce was absent from home the night of his murder. So when Chief McIntosh was killed, she wasn't there. In Billy Jane's book, it actually says she ran to Senoia. I don't think a 2-year-old could run that far, that quick. But somehow she got to Senoia. All I know is she was relocated to the Senoia area. Her brother, half-brother, Chili, was at the house there in Whitesburg, but he escaped through a window, jumped into the Chattahoochee River, and got away. In her article, Alice Bagley Fall wrote, "This 15 years old slip of a girl was delegated to move the Indians west of the Mississippi. But Croce begged to not be taken west. She didn't want to leave this area." So 3 members of the local militia, Dr. Calvin Jones Fall, who was Alice Bagley Fall's father-in-law, and 2 brothers in the Senoia area, Richmond Bridges and Solomon T. Bridges, agreed to let Croce remain here and not go west. Now, the Bridges brothers were slave owners. Bridges' home was on what is now Luther Bailey Road, inside what's now the city limits of Senoia. And actually, if you're crossing Highway 16 at Crooks, getting onto Luther Bailey Road, the 3rd house on the left, white 2-story frame house, that's where the Bridges plantation was. So that was Richmond Bridges' home. He had a brother, Solomon. This road right here beside us is Stallings Road. It goes out past the city cemetery. And after a few miles, it changes to McIntosh Trail right at Byram Road. That's where Solomon Bridges' home was, on the right after you cross Byram Road. And you can still see those graves up on the hill. We've gone up and examined them also. Each brother had a cabin built on his property for Croce. She could come and go as she pleased, and she supported herself by spinning. Croce later married a slave of Richmond Bridges. They had 2 children, Chili, named for her half-brother, and Anise, A-N-I-S-E. The important thing to remember here is this is the only place we have ever found those children's names published. Last April, when some of us went to Whitesburg to the McIntosh Reserve, and a lot of the McIntosh descendants came here the next day and visited with us and had a meeting. We spoke with Dr. Dave Lowry, I believe it was. He lives in Panama City, and he was just blown away by the fact that we found something of this importance in a book here in Coweta County. Well, let me skip that. And the thing that I kind of left out, I had this book in my car. I had not looked at the book. And I had a friend who was riding with me to a meeting in Newnan, and she picked up the book and was looking at it and went to page 38 and found this article. I'd never seen that article before. It just happenstance, I guess you'd call it. So I was intrigued that it worked out like that. Now, as far as information about the author of the story, give her a little bit of, show what her credentials were. Alice Baggerly Fall was born February 10th, 1855. She died in 1936. She was an early postmistress of Senoia and a teacher. She was also the daughter of Reverend Francis Warren Baggerly. Reverend Baggerly is noted below there, founded the Methodist Church in Senoia in 1861, worked as a farmer, ran a sewing factory, and several other things. I'm not saying that they live there, but now I'm curious if the Baggerlys might have later moved to the Bridges property, because where Trey Baggerly lives in town in the old historic house, he said that's not where his ancestor lived. Don't know. This is a timeline. I'm proud my daughter put this together for me. It shows in 1823, that's when Croce was born. And that particular year is shown in Billy Jane's book. April of 1825, that same year, as I mentioned earlier, Chief McIntosh was killed in present-day Carroll County. And then roughly from 1825 to 1838, there were several waves of Native Americans who were moved out west. And that ties back to Croce being approximately 15 years old when she was asked to take some Native Americans out west, and she didn't want to go. 1855 is when Alice Baggerly Fall was born. So using the timeline, in 1863, that's when Croce, who was at that time about 40 years old, and her son Chili was about 22, and I'll explain that in a moment. They died of smallpox here in Senoia on the property, on the Bridges property there in town. And they were buried in Senoia, leaving Croce's daughter, Anise, behind.
Were they buried at a cemetery? Or where are they buried? Oh, sorry.
This is a picture that we have here at the museum for Alice Baggerly Fall. Thank the lady for helping me get that. And Reverend Francis Warren Baggerly. If you look at him close enough, she really looks like her daddy, and it's a shame. He's kind of scary looking, but that's the only picture that the Baggerly family has ever seen of Reverend Baggerly. All right. Now, I don't know if you can see this too well, but let me just skip to the next page. See that red rectangle that just got added? This is a map, and hopefully you've seen that map right around this corner on the wall. I remember when Doug helped put it on the wall. This is 1898 Senoia, and it shows in that red area the property of Richmond Bridges and also Bridges Street. It's not Bridge Street on that 1898 map. Today it's Bridge Street. Has been forever as far as I know. But back in the day, it was Bridges Street, and it went straight down to the Bridges plantation. Now, of course, on that same map, Main Street in downtown Senoia is spelled M-A-I-N-E. So I don't know if they're a bad speller or what. But just to give a little coordinates there, the darker line going across for the most part in the middle, that's the railroad, the East-West Railroad. So if you come down from where the Methodist Church is in town, that's on what we call Bridge Street today, that crosses Wells Street at the time, which is now Highway 16, and goes down to the Bridges property. And while I'm thinking about it, also put on your calendar for July 28th, because that portion of Wells Street or Highway 16 is going to be dedicated as the Ellis Crook Highway. And it's from there in Senoia, where the stores are, up to the roundabout in Turin. So, Joanne Utt was one of the founding members and leaders of the Historical Society. Her husband, Charles, or Chuck Utt, told me years ago that he knew where the graves for Chief McIntosh's daughter and her son, he knew where they were located. And I had talked with Uncle Ellis about the graves being on some of that property too, because, well, let me hold that thought. So on September 17th, 2019, several members of the Historical Society, including Ellis, met with Mr. Utt at his home. Nancy, I think you were there. Nancy, weren't you there that day?
Yes.
I thought so. So we met Mr. Utt, and we walked to the property that was adjacent to his house. And when Ellis was much younger, the Crook family used to live across the road in that white frame house where the Bridges plantation was. And back in the day, my grandfather, Crook, owned pretty much all of the property coming up Luther Bailey from 16, where the white frame house is, and across the street, and all the houses that are there now, and the pastures behind there, because we had a horse when I was younger. So all that was Crook family at that time. So while we were out there, Chuck and Ellis, and I'll show you a picture here in a moment, both seemed to be in agreement that they thought they knew where the two graves were located for Croce and her son, Chili. And each grave had one or more large stones marking its location. About 10 days later, Dr. Gary McIntosh and his wife came to Senoia, and they visited the graves. Dr. McIntosh is the great-great-great-grandson of Chief McIntosh. And he and his wife, Carol, will be here at the museum on September 12th from 1 to 4, that Saturday afternoon. So this is a picture showing Mr. Utt on the left and Ellis Crook on the right. And you can see the stones, hopefully, from where you are. Nice sized stones in front of each one of them. That's Mr. Utt's house in the background.
Is that White House the house where Crooks lived?
No.
That's Mr. Utt's house. Oh.
That's Mr. Utt's house here in the background.
Great.
It's on the same, the white frame house is on one side of the street. It's on the left going out of town. And the graves are on the right side in the woods.
They're not marked in any way.
They're not marked in any way, no.
How did Mr. Utt know that that's what they were?
I think it ties back partly to what I mentioned before, oral history, because that's how Ellis undoubtedly knew where they were. Because it wasn't documented anywhere until we found it in this book, one page.
Okay.
This is a picture of Ellis and his siblings, which included my mother. And yes, my mother was a crook. But they're standing in front of that white frame house, which was the Bridges plantation home. In 2019, that's myself and Dr. McIntosh and his wife, Carol, standing on the porch. And Dr. McIntosh looking at where we believe some of the graves are. And I say believe because word of mouth. We haven't done anything scientific. We've done something I'll share in a moment. So we have attempted, and this is not intended to be political one way or the other. I'm not that kind of person. I'm just stating facts. But we've worked with the city, primarily through the city manager, not the current one, to segregate the grave sites from a much larger tract of land, because it's like 140 acres that David Lindsay is going to be developing. And we wanted to segregate some portion of that out so that we could keep these graves isolated. Because there's a lot of graves in there. I'll mention that. So the city advised us on November 30th, 2021, that David Lindsay, the developer, had executed a quitclaim deed on a portion of the property. So that site should now be owned by the city of Senoia. And I say should because looking at, if you're familiar with Q Public, that shows tax records and things like that, it hasn't been processed yet. I know the city's got a lot of stuff going on, and they have, this isn't their top priority. But we hope to work with them to make some things happen. Although initially planned, there's been no ground penetrating radar. That's something scientific, that if you have the equipment to do it and the funds to pay for it, you can get somebody in there with ground penetrating radar, and they can confirm or deny that there's something like a body in that grave site. So until we do something like that, we won't know if the amount of property that has been deeded to the city is adequate or not. Now, this is the fun part. We did invite some members of the Coweta Grave Dowsers to visit the grave site. This is not scientific, but it is interesting. And I got a pretty good respect for this. Sometimes go to their Facebook page, Coweta Grave Dowsers, and look it up. They've got videos. And we met with them not only at this property, but we met with them at the city cemetery so they'll do it blindfolded for you if you want, and tell you where somebody is buried.
Sorry.
And all of the ones like at the city cemetery where they found something buried, they're not all in marked graves. It's just strange. They use a dowsing rod, which is nothing but a coat hanger, cut into a length, and they hold it, and it moves in certain ways, telling that it's male, female, adult, or child. You can't do that with ground penetrating radar, but there's nothing scientific about what they do to lend credence to the fact that it's correct. But it really is interesting. As of January this year, again, not mentioning any names, but the city manager is no longer a city employee. So we're starting over from scratch, and Shelley's helping with this. And once things kind of die down a little bit with the city, I hope that we can meet with them and try to pursue some of the things that we think need to happen. Some of those being follow up on one or more grants to help defray costs, have GPR performed to identify the graves, clean up the area so that visitors could get in there. Because right now, the only way you can get in is either by trespassing on the Utz former property or by driving in directly into where the city well is. I don't think it's in use anymore, but there's a little concrete block house there. And there's room for one or two vehicles, and that's all, right where that city well is. So we'd like to get that taken care of, put up some signage eventually to explain the site, and even publicize the existence of the graves and encourage people to visit. Vicki and I have been in rest areas or visitor centers as part of a trip, and there have been brochures about Coweta County to include what's not there anymore, but Barbie Beach was on there. If you can get Barbie Beach on a brochure, we should be able to get this grave site identified once it's all approved. Now, the interesting thing too, remember I mentioned the daughter, Anise. We don't know what happened to her. It could be that she stayed in this area, married, had children, and Chief McIntosh's line may continue through the Senoia area, through her. We don't know. I have asked for assistance from Monica Haynes with the Coweta County Genealogical Society. She's doing research on that. And local historian Susan Watley is helping also. And I hoped she would be here tonight, but earlier this week, I even called a friend of mine that I used to work with for years at NCR, Charlotte Bridges, and see if maybe she could help find connections to Anise and some of the others. So that kind of tells you about Crosey's flight to Senoia. We don't know how she got here, but we know she got here. Yes.
Just a quick question. Why do you think they were not buried in the cemetery? Is that because, I mean, any thoughts on
Well, both brothers had their own cemeteries.
that? Oh, okay.
Solomon had his cemetery up here on McIntosh Trail, and his is a nice one with a big iron gate. Richmond had a family cemetery, and a lot of people did that. Richmond also was apparently hurting for money because there's another document that we have located where Richmond went to the Confederacy to ask for money for his son's. Well, I left that out. Didn't mean to, but Richmond Bridges had a son. I lost the page somewhere. He had a son named Richmond Bridges' son was Jones, and he joined the Confederacy during the Civil War. Crosey's son, Chili, had been Jones' companion from childhood. They were best buddies. And he went off to war with Jones as Jones' attendant. So Jones Bridges came down with smallpox. He came home and he died at age 22, and that's documented. Chili was quarantined with smallpox as well. And his mother at first was forbidden to enter, but she couldn't be stopped. She went in to help her son. She was finally permitted to, quote, go to her son to die with him. And both were buried on the site of the pest house. So those are the two graves that we believe are located, or two of the many graves that we believe are located there. And one thing that the Coweta grave dowsers pointed out to us is that the graves in a cemetery like that are lined up based on the tradition that people held at that time, because, well, like it or not, the white members of the family had a greater distance between the graves. The slave members were put closer together. And then down below the family graves, according to the grave dowsers, there are more Indian graves because the Creek Indians, that's why they were named Creek. They like to live around water. and they lived around that creek down there at the bottom of the hill. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of graves that they could detect because the Indians put one just about, not literally, but almost on top of each other. So that's,
No, it's helpful, thank you.
I apologize for leaving that page out.
I think records of the quote pest house, since that was not just for, I'm assuming not just for slaves, because Jones was there, so are there any records of where that was located?
Not that I'm aware of. And I can't tell from reading this if the pest house was on the Bridges property or if it was a public pest house. I don't know. I know when my grandparents lived there, there were several little sheds coming up the left side of the driveway that goes to the back of the house. But I don't know if any of that was a pest house or where it was.